The sky was completely dark, with no visibility. 2 muted bullets were fired at the signal, and 2 guards fell to the ground. For the following 15 minutes, shots kept coming. When all was quiet, the radio started to reverberate. The structure cleared, prepared for removal. After 14 years, I was sitting by the window of my hotel room, drinking my vodka, remembering how it all started and thinking back on how I got here. As I swallowed, the liquid burned, echoing my memories from the previous few weeks. I did, however, cling to the hope that there was yet hope. You see, I discovered that my 12-year wife was having an affair 6 weeks ago by accident. The discovery was accidental. But isn't that how most naive spouses learn? Oh, and my name is Logan Jimmy. After we met in our junior year of college, Jimmy and I dated until we graduated. While I enlisted in the Marines, she started looking for work. At the time, I was stationed somewhere, so even though I loved her, I didn't want her to marry me. She felt that it was unjust. I went back home 5 years after finishing my Marine duty. I was hired by a big corporation in their sales group after only a few weeks. It came out that my supervisor was a former Marine who liked to hire people with our level of discipline in the workplace. I did a great job at work and became well known. I chose this time to look into online dating services and re-enter the dating scene. I discovered my college sweetheart Jamie on one of them, much to my happy surprise. God, she looks amazing in those photos. Although Jamie doesn't have the appearance of a supermodel, she does have a body. She prioritized remaining in shape while attending college and pursued modern dance. What a shape she has, too. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches with dancer's legs, she has a physique that is wonderful and is not overtly muscular. Her dark brown eyes and long, flowing hair frame her face, and her smile never fails to make me grin. I signed up as soon as I could and got in touch with her right away since she has that girl-next-door look. Sweet and innocent, with a hint of edginess. She didn't reply for a week, asking me where I'd been and why I hadn't emailed or contacted her in the previous 5 years. If she was this angry at me for not getting back to her during my Marine duty, she must have missed me, which was a very encouraging indication. After a year or so, we were married and had our first child, Rebecca, a year after we started dating, and very much picked up where we had left off in college. My career was going well, despite the fact that I was traveling more than I had planned. After our second daughter, Amy, entered the scene 2 years later, I was promoted. We moved into a beautiful house in a nice neighborhood with top-notch schools, and although I still travel a lot, sometimes for up to 2 weeks every month, it's still necessary for my job. I told Jamie that it was a necessary part of my job and that it wouldn't be long before I was promoted to the next level, which would significantly reduce my travel and allow me to be home more often. It wasn't until a few years later that Jamie started asking when I would reduce my travel because she missed my presence and felt safer when I was at home. Looking back, I should have seen there was problems brewing, but I fully loved and trusted my wife, so I was blind to the early warning signals of a problem. She reluctantly accepted this, but wasn't delighted to see me depart on my next trip. She would blame me for things unrelated to me, saying things like, "If you were home more, this wouldn't happen," or, "We need you here, not gallivanting all over the country." It took me some time to see that she had a point, but our disputes about insignificant issues were the first hint. The second hint came when I was looking for a shirt in the laundry and discovered some of her new pants. It was silk pants and a silk top. My wife usually wears sweatpants or a t-shirt for bed. The one Victoria's Secret item I ever bought her. She wore it once, and never again. The lingerie I discovered was unfamiliar, so I figured she bought it for herself. The third hint was the decrease in our bedroom activity. We used to have passionate and romantic encounters in bed, but she stopped talking about it and kept saying things like, "Exhausted myself." It didn't seem like a big deal at first, and I thought things would get back to normal once I stopped traveling. I knew that pressing the matter would make an already difficult situation worse, so I held back. The last blow was devastating when it was first revealed, and I wasn't sure I could take it. At a farmer's market 40 miles from our house, a mutual friend saw Jamie with someone. Thinking at first that it was me, he saw them holding hands, laughing, touching, and kissing. My cell buzzed as I was leaving a meeting. Frank called and said he had something important to discuss. I still remember that call, and when he got close and realized it wasn't me, he quietly walked away, sensing something was wrong. They drove off. There was a hint of anxiety in his voice when I told him I was between appointments and couldn't chat, but he agreed and requested me to contact him as soon as possible. I assured him I would and asked if it was important, to which he answered it could wait. When I called Frank back later that evening, I asked him why he was calling and what was so important, and he hesitated before admitting that he had seen my wife out with another man earlier that day. I hung up, not thinking much about the call, figuring if Frank would have told me if it were urgent. I was nervous, so I inquired whether she was with a friend. Frank tried to break the bad news, saying that they looked like a couple, holding hands, laughing, kissing, and he apologized for having to tell me that my wife might be having an affair. I was left feeling blank by those comments. How could he have thought so, since we were a happy married couple and she had no reason to think that way? I was unable to finish the idea. Thoughts of the earlier clues began to make sense, but I refused to believe it. Frank brought me back, saying he understood that it was difficult, but that I needed to be aware of it. He said that there might be hope for my marriage to be saved, and he offered his support. I thanked him and acknowledged him, then hung up, sitting on the bed and trying to figure out whether this was all a cruel joke or not. As I pondered, anger intensified at the thought of my wife cheating. During the flight home, I began to cool down and think more clearly about what needed to be done. Without solid evidence, I didn't know where to start. Upon landing, my first call was to Frank, seeking details about the man she was with. Protecting my daughters from our issues was crucial. I wanted to salvage our marriage. Frank advised me not to do anything I would regret and shared that he had a friend who went through a similar situation. He suggested I talk to him for insight on handling the situation, emphasizing the importance of avoiding trouble or making things worse. Frank's advice resonated, and I realized I needed guidance from someone who had faced a similar situation. Right now, the best course of action is to head home and act like everything is normal. If she suspects you're onto something, it'll be tougher to gather evidence against her. I hope I'm mistaken, but I'm certain about what I witnessed that day. Frank was correct. Upon reaching home, I managed to compose myself enough to behave normally around Jimmy and the girls. It wasn't a walk in the park, but I somehow pulled it off. In the following days, I searched the house for any clues of her affair, but nothing stood out yet. A nagging feeling persisted that I might be overlooking something. Frank called, suggesting I talk to his friend. I agreed to meet them at a bar across town the next day, after work, keeping it from Jimmy by mentioning late meetings. In the dive bar, I found Frank and his friend Mark in a back booth, nursing beers. Frank looked up as I sat down. Mark greeted me as the friend Frank had mentioned. We exchanged greetings, though neither seemed thrilled to be there. Mark spoke, having been briefed by Frank on my situation. He empathized with my feelings but warned against making the same mistakes he did, sharing his painful experience of revenge. It led to a 5-year prison term and losing everything in the divorce and lawsuit against his wife and her boss. He cautioned me against doing anything foolish, his gaze intense. I simply nodded, curious about alternative approaches. I inquired about what he would have done differently. Mark admitted he'd still go after the boss, but in a subtler manner to catch him off guard. He expressed deep contempt for the man who stole his wife. As for his wife, knowing what he knows now, he'd have opted for a divorce. Our conversation then delved into the do's and don'ts of my situation. The initial step was to secure damning evidence of my wife's infidelity to prevent any denial when confronting her. The second step involved consulting a divorce lawyer to understand how to protect assets and determine my rights in this situation. The third was to keep a substantial amount of cash on hand in case she discovered my actions and froze accounts and credit cards. Lastly, securing a small apartment or alternative living arrangements was crucial in case I decided to leave, ensuring I had a place to stay. While these suggestions were sound, I initially believed I could resolve the issue through conversation. However, as soon as I mentioned this, Mark pounded his fist on the table. Mark emphasized the importance of not doing anything stupid, pointing out that her new boyfriend might be filling her head with tales. He suggested that before approaching my wife, I needed to understand what she had been told and what she believed. I confirmed that I was a Marine. Mark asked me about my military service, which caught me off guard. He continued to emphasize the need of having a plan and strategy, drawing connections to my current situation. I sighed, struggling to accept the possibility that my seemingly happy marriage could come to this. Mark apologized quietly, and we sat in silence until Frank broke it, asking about my plan and how I wanted to handle the situation. Mark drew parallels to my military background as a Marine, highlighting the significance of good intel in battle. Sensing the need, I acknowledged that I wanted to keep my marriage intact, but that I also wanted the other man to suffer without me having to give up my freedom. I also made it clear that gathering evidence and intelligence on my rival was of the utmost importance. Mark grinned at my last statement, warning against hiring a private investigator, citing his own expensive and fruitless experience with access to her bank account, credit card accounts, and phone records. He also suggested looking into any strange purchases or calls, as well as considering the possibility of getting a second cell phone and installing hidden cameras throughout the house to record both visual and oral recordings. Despite the discomfort, I complied, determined to hold him accountable. Our conversation went on for another hour, during which I mentally noted the suggestions. Mark's advice reminded me that I should wait to discuss the situation at work until I'd identified my wife's potential lover, because there was a chance that someone who knew my schedule would figure it out. He also said that he would have approached his wife's lover in a more subtle way, which made me determined to figure out a way to trick this person. But I needed more details and help. The following workday, I looked over my travel schedule for the next month and saw that I had only planned a 2-day trip. Fearing that someone at work would know what I was doing, I spoke to my boss in private and suggested that I extend the client visit to a full week. He immediately agreed to the plan. The next step was to pretend that I was away and then covertly return using a prepaid debit card that I paid for with cash. I bought a return ticket on another airline online. I bought multiple spy cameras and a regular camera that had a strong zoom and good low-light capabilities. These were the first steps in my plan to find this person. The second part was to record them in the act on video so that any doubts about her infidelity would be removed. My day was spent carefully organizing and arranging, something I'm very good at. But the one thing I couldn't figure out until later was the name of the man who was involved. I knew it would take some time to find out, but I was determined to see this through, and by the end of the week, all the things I had ordered had been delivered to Frank's house. All I needed now was a chance to covertly put the spy cameras all over my house. The house would be empty because Jim was out shopping with her girls and mother on Saturdays. But after a few hours, all the cameras were set up and tested, and I could even watch them in real time from my laptop or tablet over the internet and see what was happening. After installing the cameras, I started looking for clues around the house. First, I looked through her credit card bills to see if there were any unusual charges. Then I looked through her closets to see if she had bought any new, more revealing or shapely clothing. Although I couldn't find any hard proof, I did find a few more recent items, one of which was a very short red dress that I had never seen her wear before, and which bothered me because I could never imagine her wearing it for anyone but me. I decided to go for a 5 jog in my running shorts and shoes, a long run that usually helped me to decompress and find clarity. When I got home, I saw Jamie's car in the driveway, which meant that my girls, who I called my angels, were home. I called out to Jimmy, and they happily came running out of the family room to tell me about their day. Jimmy came out of the kitchen, asking about my run and giving me a kiss on the cheek before shooing the girls away. I made dinner, which was pork chops, and then I enjoyed a shower and our evening meal before putting our girls to bed. In the family room, we watched TV, though my obsession. When I saw Jim's purse on the hope chest in the bedroom, I decided to take a chance and look for clues. To my dismay, I found a cheap cell phone that I had never heard of before. I turned it on, recorded the number, and looked through the call log, finding only one unfamiliar number, which I also noted before turning the phone off. This newfound evidence forced me to finally accept that she was having an affair. Heartbroken and consumed with a desire for vengeance, I remembered Mark's advice to act patiently and quickly changed, pretending to be asleep when Jimmy eventually joined me, avoiding chatter to avoid unintentional admissions. The following few days were difficult as I tried to keep my composure in the face of overwhelming evidence. The morning of yet another work trip drew near, so I went about my usual business, loading my bags into the car and asking Jamie, in passing, if she had any special plans while I was away. She gave me a strange look and I hurriedly said goodbye, wondering if our home's security cameras would catch her with the man in question. I prayed that she wouldn't bring him into our bed, but I was growing more and more convinced that she wouldn't have cheated on me prior to all of this. In the following days, concluding my work with the particular client in record time, I packed up, preparing to return home that evening. I monitored the video feeds from the cameras but found nothing unusual. Consequently, I opted to review earlier recordings. The system initiated recording when someone entered the camera-equipped room, storing all footage centrally accessible remotely. As I fast-forwarded through that day's recordings, I discovered a moment when Jimmy was on her secret cell phone. I stopped and reversed the video to observe her answering the phone, then played it at normal speed. The audio quality was poor, but I heard enough. She was speaking to someone, referring to them as baby. They discussed my absence for the week and the logistics of meeting discreetly at a motel. Despite my urge to hear the rest, she laughed and turned her back to the camera, making it impossible for me to catch the entire conversation. When she turned back, she continued instructing the person to park down the street at a coffee shop a few blocks away. "Okay, baby, I am so excited. I promised to visit you that night." I was shocked to learn that he was going to spend the night at my house and on our bed. I considered getting rid of his body, but Mark warned me not to act hastily. I forced myself to wait for the right time, even though the stress was getting too much. My wife, the love of my life and the mother of our 2 children, was betraying me. What was causing her to do this? What had led her to fall in love with another man? The flight back home was too quick. I wasn't prepared for what was to come, so I checked into a hotel and thought about what to do. I knew that this was the night he was coming to my house, and I wanted to see him for myself. Was he someone I knew or someone from work? That much information was necessary for me to make a decision. I didn't know what time he would arrive, so I waited outside the coffee shop across the street. I didn't know what he looked like, so just to be safe, I rented a car at the airport and found a spot with a decent view of the parking lot. I brought my camera, checking the zoom quality. Then, at about 9 o'clock at night, a silver BMW M3 pulled into the parking lot. I started taking pictures, and luckily the lighting was good enough to show me his face, which I did not recognize. He parked on the opposite side of the lot, away from the coffee shop, and then started walking towards my house. I sat there, taking a deep breath to control my rage, and I used the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to view the cameras in my house. After a few minutes, he entered and gave my wife a passionate kiss. I forced myself to calm down and listen to their chat, during which he shared his thoughts about her all day. They talked about having the house to themselves until the next morning since she had sent the kids to her parents, and I wouldn't be back until Friday. Right there in our living room, I watched as he began to undress my wife. She returned the favor, and in a matter of minutes they were completely naked, their hands all over each other. She offered to take it up to the bedroom, and they both ran out of sight of the camera in the direction of the stairs. I heard them laughing as they left their clothes all over the floor, and I knew I had to take action. Fortunately, I exited my car and made my way down to my house, where they hurried upstairs, leaving the front door unlocked. I immediately went for his pants and found his wallet, which contained all the information I needed, plus a little more. After retrieving his wallet, I made my way to my home office, which is located on the first floor across from our bedroom, to reduce the possibility of getting hurt. I turned on my computer and the printer scanner and waited for them to warm up. Once they did, I started scanning items from Stephen Bannister's wallet, copying his driver's license and other details. I walked silently up the stairs, and when I got to the top, I could hear them making love to each other. The bedroom door was ajar, and they thought they had the whole house to themselves. I moved slowly in the direction of the bedroom, their voices growing louder, and there I was, standing in the doorway, watching Steve naked on his back and my wife in the traditional 69 position, making love to each other. They were so into it that I was able to slip a few steps into the room without them noticing. I wanted high-definition footage, but I was aware that the hidden cameras didn't provide the best quality. I recorded for a few minutes before fighting the urge to attack him with a baseball bat and listening to Mark's wise advice to don't do anything stupid. With that, I slowly backed out of the house and drove back to the hotel. I was feeling very angry, more than I had ever felt before, and I couldn't remember ever being this angry before. After calling Frank and telling him what I had done and the information I had gathered, Frank apologized for what I had done and said he was worried about me possibly being in the house again. I thanked him and said I needed to talk to someone and that I was going to ask Mark for a favor. Frank agreed to set up a meeting with Mark over the weekend because Mark had indicated that he would be willing to help. After the conversation with Frank, I tried to fall asleep again, but was unable to do so. After dropping off the rental car at the airport, I picked up my own car and drove directly to the office to check in and speak with Hal. I had to cut down on the amount of travel I did for work. I went into Hal's office, shut the door, and explained my circumstances. I mentioned that my wife would prefer that I spend more time at home and that I would need to make adjustments to my travel schedule. I looked at Hal, waiting for his response. Hal told me that my promotion had been approved, which, after I told him about the incident in which I caught my wife with her lover and recorded it, Hal expressed shock and sympathy and offered to help. I told him that I needed to be home more in order to save my marriage, and I asked him to keep it a secret out of concern that someone in the office might be involved in leaking information about my schedule. Hal agreed to cover for me if I needed time off to collect evidence against my wife. I told him that I wanted to face her with concrete proof in order to either protect myself in a divorce or keep the marriage intact. Hal nodded and agreed to help. I thanked Hal, went out of his office, and tried to act normal going home that night, my girls attacking me as soon as I walked through the door, and had to fight back tears, thinking about how they would be affected if a divorce happened, not liking the idea of having to get permission to visit my own children and having to get custody of them on Saturday while my wife and kids were out shopping. I went to a diner to meet with Mark and Frank. I told them how far I'd come with my information gathering, and Mark complimented me on my bravery and said he was surprised I hadn't done more. He asked how he could help, bringing up Frank's comment about my time in prison. Both of them looked curious. I spent the next hour explaining my plan and what I hoped to accomplish with Mark's connections. When I was done, Mark smiled and said I had a great idea. He mentioned he knew someone who could help, and he said they might be able to recommend others, but he told me they would probably expect payment. After discussing a few more ideas, which I planned to implement as soon as possible, Mark agreed to make some calls to his contacts. I gave him my cell number and asked him to get in touch with me once he had spoken with his friends so we could finalize the details. The rest of the weekend went as most weekends do, with one notable exception. Sunday night, when my wife and I usually make love, she wasn't feeling well. It wasn't the first time this had happened, so it wasn't surprising, but it had been more than a month since our last intimate night. I was going to have to tell my wife that my next trip would be longer than expected, but she was understanding, and I tried to lighten the situation by joking that I would be around so much that she would get tired of me. But she didn't respond well to that joke. Instead, she sighed and told me to call her when I arrived at my destination. I hurried out the door before I said something I would later regret and drove to the airport. The meetings with these clients went extremely well, and a deal was reached early, allowing me to return a day early. Throughout the week, I kept checking the cameras, but he did not reappear at my house. However, I did see her on that secret cell phone of hers, so I listened to her conversation, and I knew this was the opportunity I was looking for. Although it was shocking to hear what she was planning to do, I went to the office and found the items I had ordered waiting for me. Knowing my wife's regular schedule, I could easily set up one of these items that I obtained with little chance of being discovered. She went to the gym 4 times a week, and I knew. The next thing I did was go to Stephen's condo to see if he was there. Since his car was parked in the carport, I figured he was at home, so I brought my camera and started looking for him inside. I was really lucky to see him through his sliding doors, confirming that he wasn't alone, but rather that he was with another woman, and they appeared to be a loving couple because they were kissing and touching each other. It was almost too good to be true, so I recorded their passionate kisses, and I followed them as they left together. They went to lunch, which gave me an opportunity to put the other item on his car. This was a little trickier and riskier if someone saw me, but I managed to do it without getting caught. Now I just had to wait, which was the hardest thing I could have done. I got a call from Mark saying that he had a friend who could help with my plan, and since the activities we were planning would make it unseen in public, we agreed to meet in my hotel room. When they got there, Mark introduced me to Joe, a computer hacker who could help with our scheme. Over the course of the next hour, I told them about my wife's affair and told them that I wanted to exact revenge on her lover. I also showed them copies of the man's wallet that I had stolen. Joe expressed doubts about the legality of our plan and wanted to know what was in it for him. I offered him $5,000 in cash, and he accepted the terms, but only if he received half of the money up front and the rest after the job was done. We talked about the need to enter the man's condo in order to access his computer and get more evidence against my wife. Using my laptop, Joe looked through his recent purchases and noticed 2 airline tickets to Las Vegas and a 5-night hotel reservation. These purchases signaled our decision to break into Stephen's condo, so he asked if he knew if there was an alarm system. I admitted to being unsure, so Joe agreed to look into it and let me know if there was one. It looked like my wife was arranging a farewell trip with this person. I looked at my tablet to make sure the tracking devices I put in their cars worked. I could check their locations using my tablet or smartphone. I also looked at home security cameras to make sure she had brought a small carry-on bag. When the day finally arrived, I tracked them down from my hotel room. I called Joe, and he said we should get together later that afternoon. We met a few blocks away from Stephen's condo in Tal. At Stephen's condo, Joe arrived, with his laptop, a messenger bag, and my camera. He knelt down and worked on the locks for almost a minute, and soon the door was open, and we went inside, first looking for any indications of an alarm system. Once we were satisfied that there was none, we found Stephen's computer, which was fortunately readily accessible, allowing Joe to complete his tasks. I interrupted, saying, "Wait," as I slowly recorded a video of the room's layout. Joe nodded, acknowledging the significance of leaving no traces behind, and he resumed his work while I looked through his mail, including bank statements and credit card bills. I ventured into his bedroom, capturing the condo, and Joe's exclamation of "pay dirt" brought me back to the living room. He successfully accessed Stephen's online bill payments, discovering checks and extra credit cards. I was pleased, having brought a card reader to record information from the magnetic strip. Joe proposed making copies for online purchases, potentially maxing out his cards in a few hours. Joe grinned and inquired if it was possible to empty out the man's bank account. I confirmed that it could be done, intending to carry out the transaction from the man's computer to make it seem legitimate. Joe mentioned the possibility of the bank calling to verify the transaction, but assured me that no password was necessary as I had already copied the man's social security number from his wallet. I chuckled at the man's carelessness and gave Joe the go-ahead to proceed, expressing my desire to inflict maximum damage on the man. I suggested emptying his bank account immediately and sabotaging his credit cards on the day of his return from Las Vegas. Joe enthusiastically agreed, referring to it as a fitting homecoming gift. He emphasized the importance of covering our tracks to avoid any repercussions. I reassured him that I was taking precautions to avoid detection, pointing out the latex gloves we were wearing as evidence of our caution. I went back to search through his bedroom and didn't find much until I looked in the back of his closet. I found a shoebox with several recordable DVR discs. They were labeled with the names of women. As I pulled out the box, I dumped it on his bed and started to sort through them. I didn't recognize any of the names until I saw Jamie. That idiot had recorded the two of them together, but why? Joe called me over to the other room to show me something he had found. He explained that the man we were targeting was involved in blackmail, possessing numerous videos of women with Stephen. These videos showed the women's faces clearly, but Stephen's face wasn't always visible due to the camera angles. Some emails indicated that the women were being extorted for money with threats of using the videos against them in court. Joe speculated that Stephen preyed on married women with children, exploiting their vulnerabilities for his gain, seeking retaliation. I asked Joe if Stephen kept all the videos on his hard drive. Joe replied that he wasn't certain, but suggested that the DVDs found in the closet might contain the only copies. I decided to gather the DVDs and search for a backup drive, but couldn't find one. Returning to Joe, I learned that he had located the backup drive. After instructing Joe to do a full backup and wipe the laptop's drive, I explained our plan to bankrupt Stephen by ruining his blackmail scheme. I also expressed my desire to inform the women involved that they were no longer under threat. I asked Joe to print out all relevant emails so I could set up an email account to communicate with them. He offered to set up the account from Stephen's computer, and I agreed to the idea. We wrapped up. I did one last run through the place before we locked up and left quickly. When I got back to the cars, I handed Joe the remaining money he owed me for his help. We shook hands, and he said he would be prepared to carry out the next part of our plan when it came time. With that, he drove off, and I went back to my hotel to finish up. I called my in-laws to see how my kids were doing. My father-in-law picked up the phone, and I said hello, asking how the kids were doing and hoping they weren't up to any mischief. He assured me the kids were fine and brought up Jamie's weekend trip with her friends. I pretended not to know that I hadn't spoken to her yet, stressing that I wanted to make sure the kids were settled before calling her. The fact that Jamie's father didn't know about her infidelity in Las Vegas confirmed my contempt for Jamie's behavior. My next call was to the house, which I knew she wouldn't be there, so I left a message. Then I waited an hour, and when she didn't call me back, I called her cell again. She didn't pick up, so I left a message saying, "I was worried that I had called the house, and you didn't answer or called me back, and now you don't answer your C. Please call me just so I know you're okay." I also added that if I didn't hear from her within the hour, I was going to call her parents. 15 minutes later, I received a surprise call from Jamie. She asked if everything was all right, mentioning that she had tried calling the house but received no answer. I assured her that everything was fine, explaining that I had taken the girls to my parents' house after spending time with friends. Jamie's response sounded somewhat tense. I suggested we have a night out together once I returned home in a week, but her response seemed uncertain. Feeling suspicious, I pressed Jamie, teasing her and attempting to make her nervous. She claimed to be tired and hinted at wanting to end the conversation. Respecting her wishes, I bid her good night and expressed my love before ending the call. Despite my efforts to remain calm, anger began to resurface within me. I didn't sleep well, and so I was up early doing my morning run. I got back to my hotel room and took a nice long shower afterward. I called the office and checked if anything needed my attention, but all seemed to be going smoothly there. Then I got the call every parent fears. Rebecca was injured at school and had to be taken to the hospital. At that moment, nothing mattered to me more than the safety of my child. The school called my house first, and when no one answered, they tried calling me at work, and then someone from my office called me. I called the school back, and they told me she had broken her arm and was being treated at the emergency room. I hurried out the door and headed straight to the hospital, where I called Jamie's cell, and upon hearing her voicemail, screamed into the phone that the next call I made is to a divorce lawyer. An hour later, my cell rang, and I saw it was Jamie. I turned it down and sat with my daughter while the doctor fitted her arm in a cast. She was crying, and I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. After a while, my phone kept ringing. I ignored it. Later, after I had composed myself, I called a reputable divorce attorney and scheduled a meeting for the next day. Jamie called again, which I answered. She laughed and said something about how lucky I was at the blackjack tables, but she also said she had gotten a divorce. She started crying and threatened to use the video of her and Stephen together as proof that she would get full custody of our kids. I reminded her of her absence when our child was in the hospital, crying for her mother while she was with her lover in Las Vegas. I tried to reassure her, suggesting that she could begin a new life with Stephen and possibly have more kids, but she insisted that it was me she loved and wanted. Feeling conflicted, I ended the call. After getting Rebecca and Amy settled into their own room next to mine at the hotel, I called Jamie's father to let him know what had happened at school, and that we would not be living at home until things could be worked out. My father-in-law then called to inquire about the situation between Jamie and me, and I told him that we were having some issues, but that he should speak with Jamie to get more information. He told me that he would be looking after the girls until he was certain of their safety and well-being, and even though he didn't fully understand, he wished us well and hoped we could work things out. Then I called my lawyer and told him to serve my wife. After that, I called Mark and told him to screw Stephen by making all of his credit cards zero, all of his bank accounts empty, and all of his credit damaged. Later that evening, Jamie called me, and although I was first hesitant to answer, I did so after she texted me and told me that Stephen was blackmailing her, saying that he was threatening to share videos of them from Vegas with others. I said in a cold and condescending manner that she had brought this upon herself by having the affair. I hung up, realizing that Jamie had to pay for her actions. I called Mark after deciding to break up with Jamie because I needed to talk to her lover, Stephen. I told him that I had called my lawyer to get divorce papers served on Jamie and that it would take some time. In the meantime, I wanted to move my money offshore so that only my money would be at risk. Mark asked me why I was doing this, but I told him I was done with Jamie and that I was going to give her what she deserved. Mark said we should meet at 5, so we did, and we had a lengthy conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours before parting ways. We shook hands and I gave him a large envelope. Jamie called for the next 3 days, and I ignored him because I wanted her to suffer. Finally, on Friday night, I received the much-anticipated video call. When I answered, I saw a man who was bloodied and tied to a chair. A voice in the background said that Stephen's friend had a message for him. Stephen looked at the screen, and someone spoke to him, mentioning his recent trip to Tijuana and the exhaustion that must accompany it. The speaker alluded to Stephen's financial difficulties and suggested that his current circumstances would help him hide from the bank. The speaker went on to mention Santiago and his special stew, hinting at a sinister implication. They told Stephen that they could have sued him for alienation of affection. When I looked at Stephen for the last time that day, I saw fear. That's what I call a good investment. Stephen was still alive when he was lowered into the enormous blue drum filled with Santiago's special mix. No one ever asked about him. 7 months later, I was free. I had custody of my daughters. I get to keep the house until both of them turn 18. There is no alimony or child support. I don't want anything to do with Jamie, but I drop the girls off at her house and head home. A year later, I started dating Lisa. She used to be Amy's school teacher, and it seems like Amy prefers her company over that of her mother. I haven't decided to get married, but I'm